So the title of my paper is Monstrous of Bio Power, Terrorism, and Horror. So today, the monstrous and terror meet in the context of acts classified as terrorist, notably in the case of suicide bombing, which, as Jacqueline Rose notes, is most often considered a peculiarly monstrous, inhuman aberration. Whenever I do that, that means citation. Performed by freaks of nature or culture. In addition to terror, a third signifier attaches itself to the contemporary English semantic cluster of the monstrous, horror. As the reaction, so horror is the reaction with which monstrous acts, such as suicide bombing, are supposed to be met. In his own suicide bombing, Talal Asad devotes an entire chapter titled Horror at Suicide Terrorism to the question, why do people in the West, at least liberal moralists, react to verbal and visual representations of suicide bombing with such horror? Though I will propose a different response than Assad's, I concur with him and with Rose that, in her words, suicide bombing kills far fewer people than conventional warfare, so that the reactions it provokes must reside somewhere other than in the number of the dead. Evidently, Rose continues, dropping cluster bombs from the air is not only less repugnant, it is somehow deemed by Western leaders at least to be morally superior and hence a human rather than a monstrous act. Beyond our history of official nuclear attacks, as Assad reminds us, unimaginable cruelties perpetrated in secret or openly by dictatorships and democracies, criminals and prison systems, racially oriented immigration policies and ethnic cleansing, torture and imperial wars are all evident in the world today. And while the official and mainstream discourse labors to justify such policies and acts as reasonable and necessary for the sustenance of civilization and freedom, why, as Assad asks, are there so many articles, books, TV documentaries, and films dedicated to reinforcing suicide bombing as a horrendous monstrosity? And indeed, the literature on this is huge, films and texts. So my first main section is Incitement to Horror. I would like to begin by foregrounding that meeting representations of terrorist acts with horror is the reaction that reconfirms and seals the labor of their characterization as monstrous, namely, to rather them inhuman aberrations, thereby relegating them to the domain outside humanity. If the oldest, most ingrained definition of the human is a thinking animal, the experience of horror deprives the human from its humanity insofar as horror excludes precisely thought. That horror and thought exclude each other is confirmed by otherwise divergent theoreticians who unanimously concur in that horror is not a cognitive but a physiological or affective extra-discursive state of being. Not unlike the state of, say, feeling nausea, horror is a state of being whose manifestation, based on the etymologies of the Greek freaky and the Latin horror, may be described, as Adriana Cavarero writes, as a state of paralysis reinforced by the feeling of growing stiff on the part of someone who is freezing, and further, through her mythological reference to the prototypical figure of horror, Medusa, as a state of petrification. Albeit through a different path, Julia Kristeva arrives at the conclusion that horror amounts to the fading away of all meaning and all humanity. Talal Asad, too, emphasizes the status of horror as an extra-discursive state of being, writing, "Horror is essentially not a matter of interpretation. It requires no discursive effort. It does not convey meaning. It is a state of being." This is not to say, this is still Assad, this is not to say that horror is natural. Indeed, it is always mediated by sediments and traces that have been inscribed in the body, but it requires no discursive effort. It is, in fact, its status as a state of being that precludes interpretation, understanding, meaning, and all signification that makes horror appear at first to be apolitical. And further, since it precludes humanity altogether, to be a reaction to something non-human, the monstrous. But we must not forget that although the experience itself of horror may be a state of being, and as such extra-discursive, its causation is not. That is, whether or not in the face of a certain perception, one will find oneself in the state of being in horror is something that, far from being a physiological matter, is conditioned discursively. This is not far from saying that freezing or feeling nausea is an extra-discursive and in itself apolitical state, yet their cause, say cold temperature, or that smell or taste, or even thought, that causes nausea in somebody is more often than not intrinsically discursive and likely political, which inversely means that such states of being, such as nausea or horror, can be intentionally discursively induced. We can actually see the discursive induction of or incitement to horror if we return to Jacqueline Rose's aforementioned commentary to read the rest of her sentence. Suicide bombing is most often considered a peculiarly monstrous, inhuman aberration that cannot or must not be understood, and with which, continue Rose, and with which no reasonable human being could possibly identify. To clarify the importance of adding to the cannot be understood the must not be understood, Rose continues by bringing up as an example the case of United Kingdom's Liberal Democrat Member of Parliament, how do you pronounce her, Jenny Tong or Tons? Nobody knows her, whatever. I thought that everybody would know. I will say Jenny Tong, whatever. So who, and I continue with Jacqueline Rose, who was not sympathizing with the suicide bombers, but was trying to imagine what it was like to be a Palestinian in the occupied territories. When Jenny Tong observed, "If I had to live in that situation," and I say that advisedly, "I might just consider becoming one suicide bomber, myself." So when she commented that, the Israeli embassy responded, "We would not expect any human being, and surely not a British MP, to express an understanding of such atrocities." Tong was sacked from her party's front bench. Similarly, and Rose continues with a second example, when Tony Blair said in June 2002, "As long as young people feel they have got no hope but to blow themselves up, you are never going to make progress." Downing Street apologized. Tong and Blair present two attempts at understanding that which power in its discourse has relegated to the realm of the non-understandable. And both of them, Tong and Blair, are met with the demand not to understand, a demand that is raised on the basis that no human being can express an understanding at such atrocities. The monstrous is not simply the other of human, such as animals, plants, and inanimate objects, or just the anti-human, that which wants to destroy humanity, but also that which must not be understood by humans. This demand not to understand the monstrous amounts, of course, to a condemnation and an implicit blackmail. For the injunction to the silence of horror in the face of monstrosities is imposed on any human being, so that if you understand, you are not human. And therefore, if you want to remain human, you better not understand. As Rose puts it, behind the argument that suicide bombers should not or cannot be understood lies a subtext of dehumanization. For both those who dehumanization, and I continue, for both those who commit the act and those who claim to understand it. In other words, however extra discursive the experience of horror may be, the incitement to horror is a discursive mechanism that aims at the construction of a racial divide between humans and non- or subhumans around the criterion of the presence or absence of precisely horror. And the monstrous designates that which must be met with horror. Next section, biopolitical racism. Now I am turning to the fact that such discursively induced racism is instrumental in the functioning of biopolitics as the form of power that replaced the sovereign power of the sword, as Foucault put it, in order to accommodate the needs of capitalist modernity, which relies on healthy and productive waged laborers. In Michel Foucault's words, biopower operates on the principle that the function of political power is to exert a positive influence on life, to optimize and multiply it, to take control of life, to manage it, to explore and reduce biological accidents and possibilities, in short, to foster, promote, and enhance life. Biopower is legitimate only as long as it performs this function, which means that any violence against life exercised by legitimate power would itself constitute a monstrosity, an incomprehensible, horrifying act. Yet, as we know, violence and the destruction of life perpetrated by legitimate power have remained an integral part of biopolitical democracies throughout modernity. Hence, the question of democratic power becomes, in Foucault's words, how will the power to kill and the function of murder operate in this technology of power, which takes life as both its object and its objective? In this regime, violence can appear meaningful only if it succeeds in presenting itself as necessary for the reproduction of life and its improvement towards a better, more self-reproductive life than the life that can and in fact should be discarded. Because this discrimination is necessary for the legitimacy of biopolitical violence, biopower's right to kill finds its sole justification, Foucault continues, in racism. That is, in the break between what must live and what must die. According to the logic, Foucault continues, that the more inferior species die out, the more I, as a species rather than individual, will be. Foucault calls this a racism of the evolutionist kind, biological racism, as opposed to ethnic or national racism. Yet the term biological racism can apply to a racism that draws the line between what must live and what must die by discursively constructing groups of essentialist biological hereditary characteristics, as was, for instance, the case of Nazism. This can no longer be the case in an era in which the West has de-essentialized identities and deems them to be discursive products. In spite of his reference to biological racism, Foucault himself is aware that the biopolitical racist divide between what must live and what must die requires no resource to biology, and that any other ideological construct can succeed in presenting a group of people as an inferior subhuman race that threatens the social body. As he writes, as Foucault writes, in states of the Soviet Union type, bourgeois convictions suffice to legitimize the power's right to kill or to eliminate or to disqualify, just as on the other side of the Iron Curtain did communist convictions. But as the condemnation of Tong and others suggests, we are beyond these ideological criteria that worked up until the end of the Cold War. Today's division, the racist division, falls between what can be at all discursively apprehended and what cannot, and is instead supposed to elicit a purely affective reaction, horror. Today's racist boundary, is drawn between everything that is discursively constructed and comprehended and that which lies outside discourse, a space that by now is claimed only by pure states of being and no longer essentialist biological categories and so on, such as affects, including horror. And parenthetically, I would argue that the increasing currency of affect as an object of analysis today, I believe, has to do with that. I don't know whether you notice there is a lot of literature on affect these days. So, ironically then, in the era that proclaims itself as post-ideological, anything that elicits discursive reactions is human, and anything that does not is subhuman. The monstrous as the source of horror, that is, the inability or refusal to remain within a discursive state, to enter a state of being, an extra discursive. So the monstrous as the source of horror is employed as the sensor detecting subhumanity. In concluding this section, the monstrous fulfills a central biopolitical function in its capacity of arising horror. For insofar as horror's experience is an affective state of being that nonetheless can be incited discursively, the horror of the monstrous provides the criterion for determining the bioracial break between what must live and what must die. Next section. Suicide bombing as part of biopolitics. In spite of its necessarily racist foundation, biopolitics, with its professed dedication to life, is assumed to preclude monstrous acts. Thus, suicide bombing is generally perceived in the West as a pre-biopolitical gesture, expressing the logic and sentiments of a mode of power that has never budged away from the state of pre-modern religiosity and sovereign power. As Cavarero remarks, suicide bombing is generally perceived through the stereotyped, or better, Orientalist assumption that the Islam is supposedly predisposed to assign life little value, thereby valorizing the sacrifice of life, something which from the biopolitical perspective constitutes a monstrosity. However, turning to some non-stereotyped and non-Orientalist, including Islamic voices, we hear a different story. According to Iyad el-Sarraj, the founder and director of the Gaza Community Mental Health Program, martyrdom, sacrificing oneself for God, is the cry used to express a despair where living becomes no different from dying. Rose also cites the psychologist Safik Masalha, who states that to be tempted to go to paradise means that life on earth is hell. According to these commentators, suicide bombings, far from being monstrosities, are the reaction, this is Rose again, are the reaction to an occupying army, so that the simple conclusion is that they will cease when the armies pull out. Here, martyrdom or sacrifice reveal themselves as terms for designating not devotion to God, but the unbearableness of earthly life. In fact, the unconditional demand to improve a hell-like human life on earth. Such testimonies resonate with Marx's famous commentary on religion. That's Marx. I'm laughing because I'm sure you have heard the passage 100 times, but I'm going to read it. Okay. I have to speed it through them. Religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and a protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature. It is the opium of the people. The abolition of religion as the illusory happiness of the people is the demand for their real happiness. To call on them to give up their illusions about their condition is to call on them to give up a condition that requires illusions. And because of the notorious misunderstanding of Marx's simile between religion and opium, I will quote Kojin Karatani, who stresses the point by paraphrasing it as follows. Marx attempts to say that it is impossible to dissolve any religion unless the real suffering upon which every religion is based is dissolved. Marx's point rather smooths the debate as to whether suicide bombings are motivated religiously or politically. Even when an act justifies itself through religious rhetoric, religion itself is to be understood through the modern and Marxian biopolitical prism, according to which nobody would be willing to go to paradise unless earthly life were not already hell. Hell in the biopolitical sense, as in unbearable conditions of life. It follows that by aiming at better conditions of life, the strategy of suicide bombing is itself biopolitical. That life and a better life is the primary objective is a biopolitical principle that today transcends not only the distinction between Islam and the West, but also between religion and secularity, and it is shared globally. The so-called monstrosity of suicide bombing is not an exception to, but part and parcel of biopower. Of course, remaining blind to the biopolitical logic of suicide bombing is a necessary precondition for its representation as a monstrosity to which the sole human reaction is horror. And it is precisely to the production of this blindness that much of the aforementioned literature and media on the monstrosity of suicide bombing and generally terrorism is devoted. Next section, horror as defense mechanism. We have seen that the discursive incitement to horror provides the sensor for detecting the subhuman. But there is also a further function that the horror of the monstrous can perform. Turning to psychoanalytic theory, we see that by foreclosing entirely signification, horror contrasts with repression. Refreshing our memory of basic Freudian terms, the repressed is always a signifier or a set of signifiers, a message, and its return can occur only in the form of other signifiers, a code that stands for the first repressed signifier or message. Thus, the deciphering of repression requires first the perception of the manifest code and then its interpretation. By contrast, the non-discursive state of being in horror excludes the signifier altogether, and as such, it blocks even the perception of any manifest code that the monstrous act may attempt to emit. A selective and targeted discursive incitement to horror would therefore function as a defense mechanism against even perceiving any available coded message that the dominant discourse may find threatening and therefore unwanted. Such a defense mechanism renders censorship and coercion largely obsolete, since we do not experience our affects as the result of the injunction of the law. That is, once through discursive incitement horror sets in as a physical state of being, it turns that which by the discourse's decree must not be understood into what cannot be understood. Through a kind of short circuit, the injunction to the silence of horror is experienced as a directly instinctual affect, not unlike nausea. If the horror of the monstrous can function as a defense mechanism against perceiving politically unwanted messages, then the crucial question becomes, what, if any, is the signifier or message that the dominant discourse does not want to be revealed, and that so-called monstrous acts could point to, even if only in a coded form, which as such already poses the threat of enabling its decoding. Put differently, what is the message that could explain the discourse's urgency to represent certain forms of violence, as opposed to other forms, and we'll come to that, as monstrous and to incite horror, so as to foreclose the intelligibility of their message? Next and last section, the monstrosity of biopower. I see the key to answering this question in the fact that once we view suicide bombing as part and parcel of biopower, we cannot overlook a striking paradox, namely the fact that it strives for a better life through an act that disregards not only the life of the victim, but also that of the perpetrator. In short, all life. In suicide bombing, the biopolitical goal of improving life passes through a moment at which life is treated as superfluous. Suicide bombing is the point at which it is revealed that the universal principle of biopolitics, life as object and objective, may also be based on its own exception, the superfluity of life. At first sight, one might actually be tempted to ascribe a kind of natural affinity between suicide bombing and the monstrous, precisely because, however biopolitical its goal may be, its means treat life as superfluous. On closer examination, however, we see that the superfluity of life is not limited to the attitude of the suicide bomber. In fact, it is equally reflected in the ethical demand for less lethal warfare, exemplified in the use by the USA military of unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs or drones. You may recall the drone that telecontrolled from Nellis Air Force Base in Nevada killed on January 13, 2006, 18 civilians in the Pakistani village in Damadola, based on the faulty intelligence that one leader of Al-Qaeda was hiding in the village. UAVs have, of course, been used in many other occasions, particularly since the beginning of the War on Terror. Commenting on the Damadola incident, Cavarero writes, "This episode was a conspicuous example of decorporealized destructive technology. It shows us that, in principle at least, the direct participation of the warrior in slaughter is avoidable. The UAV is based on the same principle of the superfluity of life that marks suicide bombing, except that it realizes it in a more literal form. The life of the warrior becomes literally superfluous, as all that is needed in the realm of technological biopolitical war is the technology to kill, and the victim who, through the discursive employment of horror, is already relegated to the subhuman. No need of sacrifice on the part of humans, victims or perpetrators, since none are involved in this warfare. Needless to say, collateral damage, and that's a case of violence that the discourse does not want to represent as a monstrous act that should elicit horror. So needless to say, collateral damage is not presented in official and mainstream Western media as a monstrous act, nor does it attempt to incite horror. Beyond trite expressions of regret for the loss of human life, both official and public opinion was concerned with proving the faultiness or not of the intelligence that presumably instigated the attack on Damadola, something which presupposes the acceptance in principle of the mode of the attack, should the intelligence be proven correct. In other words, the discourse surrounding the deaths of civilians in the war on terror indicts the failure of intelligence or other operational procedures rather than the ethical frame that permits such killings in the first place. As a matter of fact, the use of remote control pilotless aircrafts or missiles is, to repeat, based on the ethical demand for less lethal warfare, a demand viewed as intrinsically human and highly humane. From the biopolitical point of view, the perfect war is carried out by a decorporealized destructive technology, and the UAV realizes the biopolitical dream of justifying the unjustifiable, violence, by rendering human life superfluous in the execution of violence, which becomes an affair exclusively between technology and subhumans. Biopolitics, the politics of life, is based not, as it claims, on the purging of violence, the destruction of life, but on the purging of all life from violence. Well, this is what suicide bombing does too. It eliminates all life, that of the perpetrator and that of the victim, and leaves only violence there to emit its message. The difference, of course, between suicide bombing and the UAV is that the former, suicide bombing, treats both perpetrator and victim as subhuman monstrosities, whereas the UAV treats this way only the victims. The perpetrator is a machine, the product of a superb intelligence that, as such, must be as absent from the battlefield of violence as God is from the perpetual battlefield of earthly life. Yet, bringing together the two extreme poles of biopolitical practices, suicide bombing and the UAV, it is revealed that the universal basis of biopolitics, life as object and objective, is indeed its own exception, the superfluity of life. Treating all life as subhuman and hence killing it, as in suicide bombing, treating all life as subhuman and hence killing it, as in suicide bombing, is the coded form of materializing the repressed biopolitical principle of the superfluity of life, namely the fact that biopolitical violence can function only by, on the one hand, replacing humans with technology, and on the other hand, targeting not human life, but subhumans. Decoding the message of monstrous violence reveals the repressed principle of biopolitical violence. It is the possibility of this decoding that terrifies the biopolitical discourse and leads it to the foreclosure of the coded methods in the first place. Biopower itself exists in the terror of the revelation of its own principle. So-called terrorism, its monstrosity and its horror all constitute the biopolitical mechanism through which biopower defends itself against its own terror. In other words, terrorism, and particularly in its exemplary monstrous form of suicide bombing, is the coded return of the repressed cause of biopower's own terror. To preempt the possibility of decoding terrorism's methods, the message itself must be foreclosed. This is why the monstrous must be coupled not only with terrorism, but also with horror. Thanks. Thank you for listening.
We've got 20 minutes or so for questions.
Did I go over time?
No, you didn't. It was perfect. Who would like to begin? Mark.
I guess I've got a few thoughts. The first is I don't. I think your argument relies too heavily on your phrase was a decorporealized destructive technology that is the drone, and I think you might be in danger of kind of buying into one of the readings of the drone that we're given, which is actually, in one sense, completely false. In that you were using phrases like, in the case of the drone, the perpetrator is a machine. But what's interesting about the drone is that, in contrast to other forms of aircraft, if you treat it as a form of air power, it is unmanned, hence the phrase. There's a remarkable amount of human labour power that goes into actually operating a drone and engaging in any kind of what's called a drone strike. Yeah.
I agree entirely, so what?
Okay, but that's not unproblematic for your argument, which is about the decorporealization of this technology. Because if you read it, it depends what you mean by that, right?
Okay.
Where are the bodies? I mean, if you want the body right kind of in that particular flying machine, then yes, you're right. But
I will do the
sense in which you're fetishizing a certain kind of body in a certain
No, I'll
place.
tell you what is it's the difference. Well, let me respond to that. It's exactly the same difference as between the Christian God and the Spinozian God. The point is, you can say there was a lot of labor on the part of God to create the universe. This is the Christian God, and then this God is not in that universe. He's somewhere else, still a control, okay? Then you have a Spinozian God. You may claim that in the Spinozian God there is not even labor in the part of God to create, or I don't know, the creature labors too to create God, fine. But the point is that God is there. So if you destroy the tree, you destroy God. That's parenthetically a good ecological argument. So, if you destroy the tree, you destroy God. So yeah, that's exactly the difference. That's exactly the point. Where is the body? Of course, it's like we were talking before about Facebook and YouTube's. People, including Negri, I don't know, they imagine this is pure information. No, there is tons of labor behind that are corporates, and it's not just pure information. It's not that I forget that there is labor behind that, and there is a lot of capital too, very important, and produces capital too. But the point is, there is no body killed. The body somewhere else laboring, exactly. So I don't see why this is a criticism, what I'm saying.
Sorry, there's no body killed, did you say?
Right.
Right, well there could be, right?
No, that's the point. The idea of biopolitics is not to have a body there, in the airplane.
Okay, but what hangs on the fact of being in the airplane?
Sorry,
What hangs on that fact of being in the airplane? Why is
that you don't
particularly
kill humans, which is the point of biopolitics. You don't kill the human. The human is somewhere else laboring it and being biopolitically protected,
Okay.
having health insurance and whatever.
Yeah, but that's only if you have a certain conception of a battlefield. But what's
Which
interesting...
is the biopolitical concept.
Okay, let me finish my point, right?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay, so the point is this: if you allow for that extensive form of labour that's engaged in using the drone technology to enact any kind of killing, yeah, what that does is it actually opens the space for. It effectively opens the space for the killing of those labourers. It offers a certain kind of justification for the elimination of those labourers.
On the basis of the ethical argument that presumably they are producing something that kills. I don't understand.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Well, that has been done all along. It's like saying, would biopolitics claim, not only about UAVs, about any weapons that have been produced? Has anybody ever claimed we should kill those?
Very specific about the history of air power, which is not said of other forms of military technology. But it's not specifically to do with drone technology, it's to do with air power per se, which is that when the Western powers invented air power, and in their first use of it extensively in the colonial context, one of their fundamental points that they understood was that what this form of technology does is it completely eliminates the distinction between civilian and non-civilian.
Yes.
Yeah, but that's interesting if you're trying to engage in some kind of counter strategy, which, you know, in the context of your paper involves suicide bombings, but it doesn't have to involve suicide.
Oh, no, excuse me. If your point, if you understood that what I'm doing through this is, I don't know, say, let's become suicide bombers, that wasn't my point at all. My point was simply to point out that you cannot claim that suicide bombing is a monstrous, whatever, act without simultaneously understanding that UAV is equally, whatever. I wouldn't, in fact, I don't want them to be monstrous, either of them. I want simply to see both of them as effects of the logic of biopower. That's all I'm doing. I'm not saying,
Sure, but
yeah.
you're here talking about the power of the monstrous, right? You're picking up on the fact that suicide bombers are described as monstrous,
Yeah.
and you're saying there's some kind of contiguity between the technology of a suicide bomber and the technology of a...
Yes.
Okay, right. I'll leave aside the point about the technology then. So here's a question which might be interesting to consider, right, in the context of the conference on monstrosity, which is, well, it's not a question, it's a point, I think, right? It's impossible to imagine fascist or conservative political discourse that doesn't use the language of monstrosity. Right?
Yes, I agree.
But I think it is possible to imagine a communist political discourse that does not use the language of monstrosity. In other words, I think the other, if you like, the theoretical tools of communism, right, are such that it does not need to rely on the language of monstrosity in a way that the language of the right does.
I don't know.
Right? No,
I don't know about
no, okay, I don't know, but that's what I think.
Okay.
Right?
And when you say
I think
communism,
that-
what do you mean now? Do you mean Bolshevism or some...
Communism.
There is a difference because when I speak of communism, I don't mean Bolshevism. Bolshevism did
Okay, well, why
use the
can't
white
we do this?
monster.
So we agreed. We can talk about communism without talking about Bolshevism.
Well, I know, that's what Zizek would say.
You're sidetracking. I'm thinking about the, you know, if part of our function is to think about the power of the monstrous, right, then in a sense we need to ask what political work
Oh,
the
now-
category of the
now I
monstrous
get it.
is doing, right?
You're absolutely
So
right.
You're picking up on the fact that there is a certain kind of political work being done by the language of the monstrous when it's used to describe suicide bombers, right?
Now I
And there's
hear
a
you.
tendency that you're moving towards, I think, which is to go, well, actually,
Yeah.
you could equally describe drone technology as somehow monstrous in some way, right? And I'm
Exactly.
kind of saying, well, actually, I don't think that's
No,
what we
no,
should
I
be doing
agree
with the
with you.
language of the monstrous.
No, I
right?
agree with
I'm
you.
saying
Now I
actually-
understand you. Now I understand you. Yes, so my suggestion is precisely that, call it communism, okay? Communism would be precisely a discourse in which nothing would be named monstrous, and that's the point of this. That what I say is, do not allow yourself to feel horror. That is to say, to experience something as monstrous. Remain within the discourse. Don't allow yourself to be transposed outside the discourse in the state of being of horror, namely, don't allow yourself to see anything as monstrous. That's exactly what I do.
It's very dangerous, however, like what Susan Sontag does on regarding the pain of others, right? So there is a danger when you remain within the discourse, you see those corpses and you say, they deserved it. This is not human, this is not human pain. This is their just reward for what they've perpetrated.
Well, it depends on how you remain within the discourse, right?
Exactly. So you can say, like, if I'm within the discourse, those Jewish corpses in the concentration camp, you know, they deserve to be there.
Yeah, but here, there is a leap here. I'm not saying that, oh, as long as you remain within the discourse, you always see the situation, right? It depends on what you do, how you interpret it. I agree entirely. And Susan Sontag points out precisely one case of, yeah, I agree.
But she's saying the opposite. She's saying also,
yes.
Well, if we take the discourse away, then, you know, this is pure pain and it can be used any way you want it. But also there's a problem with staying.
Yes, here, there is not necessarily, there can be. There can be, I agree. Yeah. I'm not saying that just because you are within the discourse, we've solved the problem. No. Yeah. Yes. So.
Are there any other questions as well? Filippo, did you?
Yes, if there's time, but only if there's time. Yeah,
I think we've got, perhaps we take your question and then the next two together.
What you're saying about suicide bombers is that you know there's an inability to have any conversation about the issue. You know, as soon as anybody raises it, they have to make an apology, or you know, resign.
That's what the mainstream discourse demands.
Yeah.
Yes.
And because of that, it dehumanizes it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, what do you think would happen if, or what circumstances? I mean, how does that conversation take place?
What conversation? About
suicide bombers. I mean, at the moment, it's not possible, let's say.
Actually, it is possible, and it's being done. I even quoted, but it is possible. But the dominant discourse demands that you do not do it.
So if we were able to change the dominant discourse, what would take place? What would
Precisely, one would understand that this is the logic of biopolitics, and one would understand that it's the global situation that involves as part and parcel of itself things like suicide bombing. You have to change the global situation instead of, I don't know, claiming whatever, the Palestinians or whoever are monsters.
So it would kind of begin the process of resolving if we were able to discuss it,
Yeah.
potentially.
Yeah, I really liked your paper, and I guess the question I have is about the discursive inducement of affect and what is specific to horror that stops thought, or maybe the discursive labor that's done after the experience of horror to stop thought. And I'm thinking of Lord Donald's recent work on the sort of affective economies of, I mean, very schematic of different states of capitalism.
I have not read it, so you have to tell
And he
me.
talks about, for instance, after World War I, subject production occurred really through a mechanism of feeling impoverished, of having nothing. After World War II and the expansion of suburban post-war growth, it was through boredom. That there's these sort of dominant discourses of affect that represent an era and are mobilized in a particular way. And I guess I was wondering if one could take that construction of the discursive inducement of affect experience and then this whole apparatus that prevents one from thinking about it. For instance, religious awe is another thing that comes to mind where one is not expected to.
Right.
And do a kind of genealogy of different moments when...
That's very interesting, yeah. That's not a question. What you're saying is it's a good suggestion. What? Yeah, sure. Yeah, but I don't have anything to say about it. Yeah.
Filippo, should we take your question?
Yeah, thanks. It's more of a comment actually, just to bring in a different example that might fit in your argument. I'm not sure, but you tell me what you think. It's an example of the use of violence, which reduce, in fact, the meaning of technology or more advanced technology. And the example I'm thinking about is the hostage taking in the Moscow theater a few years ago. There was this group of Chechenian terrorists who take massive hostage and they were killed inside. And the example is very meaningful because beside the question of technology is the implicit discourse in the use of violence. There's no ambiguity in how the question was dealt with, and therefore no question of mistakes or error in intelligence, like in the case of the drone. The action there was very clear. They waited, that they knew, the intelligence was that they knew that the women, the terrorist women inside, would have not triggered the trigger without the consent of the men, the terrorist men, into the theater. So what they do is they listen what happened inside and they wait for a time where all the men are gathered together and all the women are gathered together in a different space. And in that moment, they inject lethal gas in the theater, and at the same time, they erupt within the theater using ordinary weapons. But the gas has already exterminated both the terrorists and the potential victim, the hostages. So there's no ambiguity in there. What counts? The result is the same. If the terrorists trigger the trick, they kill everybody. The state power kills everybody precisely in the same way. However, they're able to transform a military and political failure in a victory because they kill and they decide and not the other.
Exactly.
So the implicit message
Very good
is that
example.
the result is not the death of the victim, the result is who act and who define. It's not you, it's us. So let's shift a little bit. I don't know if it fits in.
Yeah, it fits totally. You have to give me a difference. Fits totally.
Are there any other hands? Anyone else have a question?
No.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought you'd indicated it.
Okay, thank you for your paper. I really liked it. I have a couple of questions or, I don't know, comments or kind of worries. I'm not sure what exactly. So, if I got your basic point right, we're saying, maybe I shouldn't try to summarize the whole argument, but basically the Monstrous reaction is a discursively produced affect that is induced by politics, and which is actually like the suicide bombing, the horror that is experienced in the face of suicide bombing is actually a horror against, well, seeing the very biopolitical truth of suicide bombing. Okay, great, got it. The worries is that first about seeing the truth of suicide bombing, or having within biopolitics reactions, almost a mimetic reaction, kind of like seeing the truth of something and like in the experience of it, the truth of it is revealed. Not sure how that would work in a biopolitical framework. Also, one more.
Okay, yes. Do you want, you have difficulty when I respond to
Yeah.
okay, that's very good. I don't have an answer to that. What I have is the following, which relates directly to what you say. Not seeing the truth, foreclosing the truth, which is, in fact, I had a paragraph on this and I didn't read it for reasons of time. Not seeing the truth is very dangerous. You know, foreclosure is the cause of psychosis. Foreclosing the truth is very, so my reading, if you ask me, what do you think, if this argument is correct, what is the implication for the politics? So I hate to use the word, I don't want to say, can you predict the future? This is like as we were trying to, but if you, okay, let's say, if this is true, what would that entail in terms of what might happen if the situation continues like that? That is, say, if we continue to foreclose the truth. Soon, that is, in fact, I had a question that was the foreclosing the truth by entering the state of being of horror is the mirror image of the other kind of psychotic act, which is suicide bombing. Any act of killing is a psychotic act, okay? Whether it's suicide, the moment it's a passage into the real, a passage, okay? So it's as if horror is the response, it's the other form of the passage to the real. The one is through violence, whether suicide bombing, attacking, whatever. The other is the passive way, horror, the petrification. I pass. So, and my question, and how long can people stay on the level of petrification? There should be a moment where they will pass into the act with violence. So for me, the horror is not so much the horror of what if the truth is revealed, but the horror of the effects of the fact that the truth is foreclosed. See what I'm saying? Though again, you're absolutely right to raise the question, and what would happen if the truth were revealed? From what follows from what I said, it follows that one day there will be a major attack on the part, I don't know, of the USA or some major country because of the accumulated foreclosure. But I don't know, you're right. Another question would be, and what if the truth is revealed? I know from experience, because I presented a similar argument elsewhere, I know that just by reading that, I do provoke reaction. People don't want to hear this argument. There is some, they don't like this thing that justifies suicide bombing. I know that people don't like it. I have been attacked for the argument, not just like Mark was trying to do it, much more aggressively. So I don't know. It's interesting. It's a very good point. So yes, you're next.
Maybe I can actually stop there. Well, because then the worry becomes like, what if the truth would reveal? Like, can you actually speak can you speak truth to power at that point? Like, can you try telling biopolitics,
right,
don't do this?
And then it becomes an enlightenment kind of argument.
Yeah.
I don't even believe that by knowing the truth we necessarily solve problems. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay, I'm aware that there are some flights to be taken, and we should probably bring the conference to a close. But I want to thank Kiarina especially for bringing, I think, showing us that monstrosity is a truly interdisciplinary idea that is working within the biopolitical in a very strong sense today. But I also want to take this opportunity to thank you, but also to thank all the speakers of the last 2 days and the participants for creating together such an excellent event. Yes, and particularly to Filippo for his work at the Collège and Brunel to help create this event. So yes, to thank everybody. And as you know, there will be the development of the collection within Philosophy Today over the next few months. So Filippo and I will be in touch with you about pushing some of these papers, I think in the early autumn, so we can continue our work through that. And yeah, thank you very much.